And that has led to some of the work that I'm going to show you today. So I just want to also acknowledge WT Grant, NSF, and the Center for Center for Business and Social Analytics at MSU, who have funded this work. So I'm going to take you a little bit backwards in time into the way that things were before. So you probably saw the title of this talk about the fifth estate, and before the fifth estate, there were three estates. Those estates were the clergy, the monarchy, and the nobility, which influenced the commoners and diffused information. Or if you lived in Britain, then you might have the monarchy at the head of your system, the clergy and the nobility, and then the commoners. And the sphere of influence was here. After the advent of the Gutenberg press and mass access to print, the reporters were considered the fourth estate of influence and were noted as such by William Burke in the 18th century. And then the influence extended to here. So these estates or organizations, people within, were influencing the public. Today we can think about a new form of educational influence, and that's the fifth estate. So within the fifth estate, after the advent of the internet and Web 2.0, importantly, networks of individuals are able to easily connect and come together and exert influence on one another and also on those estates that I just spoke about. So the fifth estate empowers these networks to directly influence and challenge traditional conceptions within education, being teacher professionalism and education reform. We can conceive of it looking like this within the United States, with the Constitution influencing the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, of which influence the public through mass media as well. And then the networks you see here are actually depictions of the fifth estate. So these are networks of individuals coming together within virtual and physical boundaries to empower, push back on one another, and also traditional conceptions of education and the profession. So here, the sphere of influence is about here. So when we think about education and preparing the next generation of teachers, or what education looks like in the 21st century, we can think about schools, teachers, parents, and students within this fifth estate. So they're both being influenced by larger traditional hierarchies and also by these networks of influence within their physical and virtual reality. And the sphere of influence is here. So what I'm going to talk about today is about teacher collaboration within virtual spaces as it extends from cloud to class. So you can see here a teacher who is, yeah, you can see my mouse, a teacher who is influenced both by her district and school, by her school-based colleagues, and then may also be influenced by her virtual networks in the cloud. While traditional educational organizations are oftentimes more in the periphery from our data. So I'm going to talk about one prevalent virtual resource pool. And a virtual resource pool is a space that contains a vast array of instructional resources. Social media affords individuals the brokerage of both virtual networks within Pinterest, but it also affords them to connect to these resources in real time. And teachers can acquire and promote their practices across their school-based and virtual-based colleagues. And we know from research that the knowledge and practices that teachers acquire in virtual resource pools contribute to their classroom practices and planning. Within Pinterest, it's an image-based platform. If you're not familiar with it, you can establish virtual networks of followers by just choosing the follow button. Unlike Facebook, you don't have to ask for permission from someone to follow them. The minute you choose to follow them, you have access to all of their information that they have pinned. You can store resources, you can scrapbook your teaching ideas, and you can create personalized libraries of information within boards. You can also repin your virtual network's resources. So if somebody pins something that you think is a good idea and you'd like to save for yourself, you can choose the repin button. And Pinterest also works with individuals by sending you updates on who they think that you are similar to, that you might want to connect with online, because you share the same pinning behaviors. So there's both purposeful and then also machine-lended virtual networking happening. So within the study of our early career and experienced teachers in our NSF grant that Dr. Vieta and I worked on, we surveyed teachers to identify how much they were using Pinterest. And what we found is that 90% of our teachers were using Pinterest for professional purposes, and that 50% of teachers were using Pinterest at least once a week for professional purposes. And this echoes other studies by RAND, Amazon Education, and NCSM that also find teachers are using Pinterest for resource access. And when we asked them, because we didn't just give them Pinterest as the only social media platform to ask them about, we talked about, you know, Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, YouTube. What we found is that teachers use social media for different reasons. And this picture of the icons with social media is actually taken from a teacher blog, and she explains why she uses social media in different ways. And for Facebook, it's for personal reasons. For Twitter, it's to stay updated on educational issues. And for Pinterest, it's to acquire and share virtual resources. And this echoes the survey results that we received from our teachers. And these patterns are consistent across districts that we sampled, which we had many different types of districts and demographics, and also teacher experience. And they're also consistent across teachers' age, which was surprising because we thought maybe there would be differences in age, but there are not. So Pinterest is also really exciting as a source of data, because what we can see is teachers' self-directed curation of instructional tasks. So basically a window into their conceptualization of instruction and how that relates to their students' achievement and also their students' learning. We can see the pins that they curate. We can see how they curate them across boards and how they connect to what we call a socialized knowledge community or virtual learning network. So we wanted to know, what do teachers, or who do teachers turn to when they are seeking out and accessing supplemental resources for their instruction? And we conceptualized this idea of a teacherpreneur, and that is somebody who is going out and directing the trajectory of her own classroom and curriculum despite risks in wasted time, resources, or energy, and resources of unknown quality. And we conceptualize teacherpreneurial guilds based on this idea of a professional guild in which people establish norms with one another, they share their expertise within their guild, create consensus around what quality means for them, and also direct and engage in decision-making regarding professional factors of their work. So we can see teacherpreneurs circumventing traditional hierarchical diffusion and actually directly interacting with one another in a teacherpreneurial guild within this education space. And you can think about this within the view of a fifth estate, because again, these networks of individuals are exerting power and control over virtual resource pools across their profession. They're self-regulating the quality of their resources, and then they're diffusing information directly from cloud to class or from class to cloud. So I'm just gonna share a little bit of preliminary work that, work that's under review right now, but it's of 197 teachers, and we looked at all of the educational resources that they pinned over time across 14,808 unique secondary online sites, so where the pins link to when you click on them, and that's 135,000 pins. And we thought about how could we classify these sites, and we thought, okay, how about teacher-to-teacher markets where teachers directly interact with one another and share and swap resources, blogs, educational organizations that are for-profit or nonprofit. MSU would be a nonprofit example, Scholastic would be a for-profit example. And then other periphery online sites and non-educational sites like Huffington Post that might have educational content. And what we find is that 75% of all pins originate from teacher-to-teacher markets and teacher blogs or educator blogs, and only 7% reflect resources from organizational sites. So what that means is that when you think about the diffusion of information within that fifth estate illustration I showed you in the beginning, you can think about the arrows or the networks of influence pushing up rather than information coming down. So who teachers are and how they engage relate to the information that they share and how they experience and react to reform. And we think this might have something to do with teacher-to-teacher trust. It might have something to do with where they work, the kinds of schools that they work on and within, and their professional affiliations. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is how we consider and characterize instructional quality. But before I do that, I just want to plug that the type of data we have allows us to think about teachers as they conceptualize instruction. We can see it in real time, and we can see this without observer bias. So we know that teachers are already carrying instructional resources, and we can examine the quality of instruction accessed and shared, and we can also examine the alignment to the Common Core state standards. And in other work, we've examined the cultural relevance of instructional quality and resources. So in order to identify the quality of instructional resources, we decided to take two different measures of quality. One is the revised Bloom's taxonomy, and the other is the depth of knowledge. So examples would be for level 1, remember, it's the task would have the potential to ask students to retrieve knowledge from long-term memory, recognize, recall, locate. And then again, for understand, it might be something more like clarify, paraphrase, represent or translate mathematical information, illustrate, give examples. So within the context of Pinterest, what we actually asked students, or what we did with our resources, is we went through and we looked at every single resource, and we considered the resource and classified the resource across both the Bloom's, revised Bloom's taxonomy, and also the depth of knowledge, and we gave them a number. So if it's remember, it's a number 1. If it's understanding, it's a number 2. And if there wasn't enough information in the image or the comment below, we would click on the image, follow it back to whatever the site of origin was, and then we would look, because sometimes in educator blogs, they'll have a whole write-up about, well, this is exactly how I implemented this task, and that might make something a 4 instead of a 2, for example. It might like raise the cognitive rigor of the task. And what we found in our initial analyses of this is that looking at a little under 1,900 mathematical tasks from 26 early career teachers, the majority of the tasks were in the lower 2 levels of cognitive rigor. So what we concluded was that the potential of the tasks early career teachers are accessing and sharing are generally at the lower level. And the next thing we wanted to do was we wanted to think about how we could scale this kind of classification. So what we did is we actually looked at using a machine learning model to scale classification of mathematics quality. And so in order to do that, we looked at the pin title, the pin description, the informational source, that's the site of origin, the comment that the teacher makes. Like if the teacher says something about, oh, this is just really cute, that doesn't give us a lot of information, versus if they say something like, I'm going to split my students into small groups and I'm going to have them rotate around the room. while I work on task X, that will give us more information about exactly where on the level of Bloom's taxonomy, revised Bloom's taxonomy, this might land. And then we also followed it back, as I said, to the primary source of origin. And we asked, how can we leverage machine learning tools with computer science techniques in order to scale this resource quality classification, with the hope that then if we give teachers a quality indicator within this relatively unsupervised space of social media, they might be able to make more like well-informed choices about the resources that they're choosing to supplement. But to do that, we had to make a couple assumptions. And the first is that teachers consider the nature of mathematics that's embedded in the image, that teachers consider the description that goes with the mathematical task, and that teachers are professionals. And so if there's not enough information to use this task within their classroom, they're going to follow it back to the site of origin. And in other work, examining teachers online and actually video recording their conversations, we find these three assumptions to generally hold. And again, you can think about this here as the teacher's within her classroom and she's considering a task and finding this task within Pinterest. It's another example of teachers' interaction within this fifth estate of networks. So this is how we build a hand-labeled data set for supervised learning. And supervised learning is when you use machine learning algorithms to scale quality. And what we do is, this is an example of a pin for kindergarten. And the activity says, square cat, then create a class graph showing if students would rather be a square or a circle cat. Ask why they make the choice they do, then count the total in each column and analyze the graph together. So that's actually a really descriptive comment compared to many of the comments. So we look at the pin, we look at the comment, we look at the source of origin, and then we show the computer where that would land within this revised Bloom's taxonomy pyramid. And we had to figure out how many pins we needed per teacher in order to give them, in order to be able to accurately assess like what they would be likely to pin, which I think is very interesting, because what we found is that after about 25 to 30 instructional resources, we generally know the kind, the quality of resources that you're going to pin over time. Which is also interesting because as teacher educators, we think that teachers are constantly revising and growing. And what we're seeing in the curation data, at least, is that generally people pin relatively similar quality tasks over time. So that allowed us to create a random sampling framework of pins by teacher to figure out how many pins we needed per teacher in order to create this classification. And we came up with 45 distributed across these years. 2016 was the last year because that was the last year that we pulled data, and 2012 was the first year because in 2011 Pinterest was in beta startup. And then we fed all of these characteristics into a machine learning algorithm to come up with a supervised learning classification of quality. And after we did that, the best results we could get was an F-score of 43. So basically that means that we are only able to not reject type 2 or type 1 error in 43% of the time. That's what an F-score means. So that doesn't mean that we have a super reliable algorithm able to scale and code for quality, but it's better than the random error, which was 20%, so it's double what a random classification would be. And actually, when we used visually similar pins, because Pinterest, if you click on a pin, then it'll come up with all of these other pins that are visually similar that are recommended. And some of them are actually identical. So when we looked at identical pins within visual similarity, then this F-score went up to 70%. So for applied purposes, like for a computer science, a scientific orientation, 43 is the number that we would report. But if I was working at Pinterest, let's say, and I said, for applied purposes, if somebody goes on there and I know that these two pins are identical even if they're from separate sources, then if I already coded the quality for this, I can give you the quality for that because it's the identical pin, then we're at 70, which is actually pretty good. So we're going to continue doing work on that, but you might be wondering, well, what does this have to do with what's happening in the classroom? Because a lot of pushback we get is, okay, it's conceptualization into like a window into teachers' thinking, but we don't even know if teachers are using this in the classroom. And we also don't know how this affects their teaching, if it affects their teaching at all. And we also don't know how it affects their students' learning. So now I'm going to talk about the influence on lesson planning as evidenced in social media. And there's a large literature on instructional planning within 21st century schooling, also just instructional planning in general. And what we find is that in social media, teachers are connecting to teachers, and teachers are connecting teachers to resources. And instructional resources frame teachers' planning and their thinking. So it might be worthwhile to consider how teachers think about their instructional content, plan their lessons, present content, and react to students, and then how that relates to their planning. And I'll show what I mean in a minute. But I wanted to read you a quote about one of our sampled case study teachers, and her name is Ms. Gonzalez. And she's one of 4 million members of a site that we would consider a teachers-to-teachers market called Teachers Pay Teachers. It's like a teaching eBay. And she says, I've used Teachers Pay Teachers because it's teachers making things for teachers. So why not get it from there? This is very relatable. Students can go somewhere and they can figure out how they can spend their money. So I wanted to make sure that those things were in my lesson. And so Teachers Pay Teachers hit the mark. So here we see, again, this example of networks of individuals coming together within a new era of the fifth estate, saying it's teachers making things for teachers, so why not get it from there? It's just a reorientation of the hierarchy of information diffusion within education. So traditionally, and I actually have adapted this map from a 1970s framework that was written about instructional planning and education. Traditionally, teachers plan and their planning impacts their actions. So I've reoriented this to say teachers curate. So teachers may curate things online, and that represents a conceptualization that they have about instruction. And this curation also represents their planning, their thought processes, and the theories and beliefs that they may hold. These things are in response to their own behavior within the classroom, their students' behavior within the classroom, their students' achievement that they're encountering as that changes, and then the observable effects that they have within the classroom. And it's a symbiotic relationship happening. So the roadmap is not necessarily reflecting explicit intentions for a particular pin or task to be put into practice in the classroom, but it's this idea that the planning that teachers have, whether formally or informally, that we found also in our project, has impacts on students' experiences within the classroom as they relate to ambitious teaching. So we asked, what is the relationship between the quality of teachers' curated instructional resources and their practices? And we situate this question within this broader NSF grant that I worked with Dr. Bieda on that examined the influence of early career teachers' mathematics instruction. So we see social media influencing two ways. First, it's this iterative professional development that relates to what's happening within the classroom, their students' assessment. And then it's also an external force that they are experiencing. And if you think about like that sphere of influence, that would be more of the external force that they're experiencing in their professional lives. And we used data from 3 Midwestern states. We had 24 elementary school early career teachers over a 3-year period of data. This is just the initial analyses, and we have the full analyses, which will be of like probably 3 or 4 times that sample coming forward this year. We surveyed teachers' engagement online. We looked at the instructional resources that they curated within their Pinterest accounts. And then we also were fortunate enough to go into their classrooms for 3 years and observe them in their classroom teaching on back-to-back observations twice a year. So we also used their ambitious teaching as rated by the True Math rubric to identify what their classroom practices were. And I'm going to focus on 2 different dimensions of True Math because True Math has 4 dimensions, actually 5, we used 4. So I'm just going to focus on 2 today. And the first is cognitive demand. So an example of level 1, 2, 3, and we can have 0.5s as well, but you can have a 0, there's no 0.5, but 0, 1, 1.5, all the way up to 3. An example of 1 would be classroom activities are structured that students mostly applied memorized procedures and or work routines. And an example of a 3 would be that teachers have to hint and provide scaffolding to students or student-to-student interactions, support students in developing a productive struggle in building and understanding and engaging in mathematical practices. So for the agency, authority, and identity dimension, this is a little bit different. It's thinking about how students are discussing and talking with one another and the teacher about mathematics. So student speech turns may be short, 1 sentence or less. That would be like a level 1, and they're very directed on what the teacher's asking them to do. Versus a level 3, which would be what we would consider ambitious, is students are explaining their ideas, they're explaining their reasoning, and they're responding to and building on one another's ideas. Which would, like when a student gives an idea on the rug, for example, discussing a mathematical task, another student would say something like, you know, I heard so-and-so say this, and I think that's a great idea. I've been thinking da-da-da-da-da, which is like so-and-so. So that would be an example. And then we went through and we compared using some regression analyses how the resource quality, the average resource quality that teachers curate within their Pinterest relates to their True Math classroom observation. And we used some covariates to make sure that we were controlling for unaccounted other things that might be impacting this. So we looked at the fixed effects for districts, the year of the observation, and also we held constant their prior teaching quality. So if you were a really amazing teacher year 1, and then you're a really amazing teacher year 2, but you're also curating great stuff, we could say, oh, it must be the curation, but you are already a really great teacher in year 1. So we're controlling out for that to make sure that we're not picking up any error there. This is an example of our model, and I'm happy to, I think we're going to share these slides if you want to go over this more. I'm going to skip it for now. And here's an example of our results. So when we looked at the cognitive demand dimension, we find that we looked at it by the revised Bloom's taxonomy rubric. So we didn't just create an average, we looked at by dimension within the revised Bloom's taxonomy. And what we find is that as the proportion of resources that teachers curate at the understand level increases, their ambitious teaching as rated in the cognitive demand dimension of True Math increases as well. And then we also examined how this impacted the analyze dimension for cognitive demand. And what we find is that within the analyze dimension of the revised Bloom's taxonomy framework, as teachers curate more resources that we would classify at this level, the teachers have a higher degree of agency, authority, and identity as rated by True Math. So thinking back, that means they're getting students to discuss and build on one another's ideas more, which makes sense if you go back to the revised Bloom's taxonomy rubric, because analyze is prompting those kinds of thinking skills. But then one thing that was surprising is that As teachers curated more resources at the highest level of the revised Bloom's taxonomy framework, which was create, they had lower ratings within cognitive demand within their classroom, and then also agency, authority, and identity. And what we think this may be about is that teachers in our sample were early career teachers. And so there may be a level of proximal development that teachers hit in which they are not quite ready to be able to ambitiously enact high-level instructional resources that are not supported by their colleagues or their district, that they just go out and supplement online. And what we also find, and this is just restating that, is that different levels of cognitive demand within a task as relates to the revised Bloom's taxonomy relate to different things that we see within ambitious teaching in the classroom, but that it doesn't actually have to be this specific task being enacted within classroom practice. It's just this broader idea that it's a conceptualization of how teachers are thinking about instruction and then enacting their instructional practices within the classroom. And we also just want to note that ambitious mathematics instructions walks up and down the taxonomy, so we don't expect to see everything at the 3 upper levels of the revised Bloom's taxonomy, but as you saw in the initial descriptives, having the majority of things at the very 2 lowest levels is probably not what we want to see either. So, back to this idea of the sphere of influence and how we think about teaching and learning and teacher preparation within a new 5th estate of network influence. I just would encourage us to think about how we can use the different sources of data that are now available to us as researchers and teacher educators to support our teachers' engagement professionally, both while they're in training and then after they leave us. And also think about how teachers are responding to different forms of influence, be it from their district, their school-based colleagues, or this virtual extension of collegial networks that they extend from cloud or from class to cloud. And then I'm just going to give a plug, which is that we have a conference coming up at the end of this month. There will be a link that if you're interested in streaming to see some of the great presentations. We have people coming from all over the world, so it's really exciting. And we have 3 special issues, 2 of which should be coming out within, well, actually all 3 should be coming out sometime within the next year. So thank you so much, and I think I'll leave time for questions.
Yeah, amazingly. Enough with the late start, we do have time for questions. So with that first, oh, you want to talk?
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Well, I want to first say thank you. It's sort of a fascinating take on a whole area that some of us as science educators have kind of played into. Thank you for that. I have a quick question about what were the sample sizes for those very traditional analyses?
The sample sizes were relatively small in the first runs, but we're going to have, so here's the sample sizes. So in the first runs, because this is just, the hand-labeled data takes a really long time in order to do, so we have like a team of experts. So it takes a long time. So we had 24 early career teachers in the first runs, but in the final runs, we're probably going to have about 200.
So you had, like, in terms of the measurement of their math instruction, they were observed twice per year?
They were observed twice per year, and then we had it at the episode level. So the true math was scored every 10 minutes, so that means that our power was strong enough because we did it at the episode level.
Okay, but it's nested with a teacher, right? So
right, so there's pins nested within teachers, nested within schools, which we control.
Probably the weakness of the significance there is how it's related.
Right, yes, so I think we'll see probably higher significance and maybe across other dimensions too, because we know that our data is it's unbalanced across the Bloom's taxonomy. Yeah, thank you for coming. Anyone else?
Well, I'm going to go. So this was the whole notion of a machine AI learning kind of evaluation of quality.
Yeah.
Was kind of a fascinating one. And you kind of went through it really quickly, and I was wondering first about the validation of that. But then the second piece of it, I don't know if it's gone on long enough, right? But the norms within these digital systems are that people start using the scoring system, right? So whatever scoring system you put in place, right? Maybe it's triggering on kind of the length and detail of description, right? And people will start gaming length and detail of description in order to get a better score without changing the content. I was sort of wondering if you observed any of that yet, or how that will.
So I will talk about the second question first, and then I'll ask you details on the other. So the gaming situation is that nobody is gaming this yet because it's not, this is not happening in an interventions type way. So the participants, it's public data. So they don't know that we're then running their pins and coding them for quality. So they wouldn't then change what they're doing as a response to that. But I could see that in, you know, my dream world, if we actually are able to then provide a quality label within Pinterest, I could then see that the top educational sharing people would then want to game the system to make sure that their quality was high. But right now we're not seeing that. And then for the first question, could you tell me more like what questions you have about the validation, I guess?
I was just, you went through it very quickly. And
yeah.
So I was wondering about the nature of the neural net model or whatever model it was that you're using for AI.
Yes.
And kind of the size of the training sets and how that develops.
I have that. I'm just going to open up because I did a short show here. This was actually a short show. And then I have these extra slides, but I didn't include them in this. Let's see. Just open recent. But this one. So so I'll show you this. This is not the actual, oh, maybe I actually have the one that is the updated numbers though. I don't think I have the one with the most updated numbers, but I'll show you this because it actually provides an idea of how we validated, but these numbers are not the most updated numbers, but if you come down after everybody leaves, I can show you the most updated numbers. What? It should come up. So we had X number of pins. Don't pay attention to the number because this was the first run and there's going to be a lot more. But then what we do is we take the image and we feed it into a convolutional neural network to extract particular properties, and it's basically a black box when you put things into a CNN, and then it comes up with a certain number of dimensional vectors that make the most sense according to the number of images that you have and how they relate to one another. And if you think about an image, you can just think about the computer taking a teeny little pixel of a certain dimension and then extracting a certain number of vectors and then doing the same thing on the next pixel and the same thing on the next pixel. And then if you think about stacking it, so they have all of these pixels, they stack them up and then they converge them. That's why it's called a convolutional neural network. So then we went through the non-negative matrix factorization and we come up with this number of dimensions. Then we also add in the text, which is something that probably more people are familiar with, which means that we're using latent, it's called LDA, like latent derelict allocation. And then also word bagging approach and other things to come up with emerging patterns and themes within text. So we take the image, we take the text, and then this is, as I said, not the most updated version, but we also use the site of origin. We use the visually similar pins to increase our sample size. So for every single pin, we downloaded 50. So that meant our sample size increased by about 200,000. And then we looked at where the quality match fell off. So like where all of a sudden it just fell off, where our hand label did not match the hand label of the visual representation. And we found that we got about 70% accuracy with the first two pins that were considered visually similar. So that means that then we took our initial hand labeled set and we multiplied it by 2. So we included all the visually similar pins. So that also helped our training set. And I will show you after the paper too. I can share the paper too. Yes. I think you had a question in the back.
I did. I was curious, so you talked about how the teachers decide Facebook they use for when you were, I don't know if you did interviews, find out that they also were considering this level when they were.
We have not done interviews asking that specific question, but it's a really great question. I would love to know the answer to it. And this is why I write grant proposals, so I can find out. So yes, that's a great question. Anyone else?
It's also related to that though, I think, going back to a lot of stuff about Pinterest is, it's smart like any other social media, right? So if you, once you pin, then they're going to give you pins that they recognize as similar to that, right?
They will populate your newsfeed with them so that when you log on, you'll see pins similar to that. Yes.
So maybe you explain this, it feels like that would be a factor in reaching that like threshold of about, after about 40 pins, you know, you basically know that what they're.
Right. Well, that may be contributing. There's the machine moderated networking happening, and that's networking between people, but then also, like you say, networking between people and content. So it's like Pinterest is moderating that, and then people are moderating that. So you and I are following one another on Pinterest, and I could say, I know that Kristen is a foodie, so I'm going to go onto your page and look for recipes because I know you're a foodie. But I could also just end up getting more food put in my newsfeed because I'm looking for recipes, or because you're looking for recipes. And because we're friends, then they might put more recipes on my newsfeed.
So related to that, thinking about early career teachers, when they first go on, let's say they start a Pinterest account, they start making all their pins for their lesson planning. Are they likely to just type in the search term and see what comes up, or are they likely to say, like, connect to a colleague and then look through their colleagues' feeds? And it seems like that would really impact the sphere of pins they're actually looking for.
That is a good question. So one thing that I'm really excited about doing this coming year is last year, I went into 4 methods courses for elementary mathematics at MSU. They were seniors, and I had them work in small groups and gave them a task to find a resource that was numbers and operations, because that's what they were working on that unit. And then we actually videotaped their desktop and what they chose to do and the conversations that they were having. And what we find is that in most cases, it's really interesting actually, like some of them are going into Pinterest and searching the term, searching numbers and operations. Some of them are going into Google. Some of them are going to the Common Core State Standards and actually looking up numbers and operations and then figuring out what they want of those, like of a grade, and then what learning, what is it called? The learning thing within the standards. Yeah, the objective basically. but I think it's called something slightly different. So yes, so they're doing that. So it's just multiple different ways of getting to the same thing. And then some people, in almost all cases, they're following the site, the link back to the site of origin. But there's also a question of, do I want something that I have to pay for or that's free? And so that's another conversation that I didn't even get into in this talk, but some of the content is free, and then some of the content is in a teacher-to-teacher market, and it's monetized. So we're gonna follow these people again this year and see what they do this year. They'll be in their internship, so it's kind of cool to see like how things will change or be the same.
Well, it's after 1 o'clock. So please, if you have other questions,
Yeah.
please reach out to Kaitlin after the background. Thank you all.
Thank you.